Welcome again, all, and to our Day of Reason brunch, and to our distinguished speaker, Tyson Gill, who is going to talk to you today about rational decision-making. Why is it so hard to apply science and reason to real problems, and how can we do better? Tyson, who's a new acquaintance and confrère, who I'm delighted to meet, and his lovely wife Elizabeth. Tyson is a research scientist with a PhD in chemistry. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in South Africa. He is currently a software developer and evangelist for fact-based thinking. Wow. Let me do that again. An evangelist for fact-based thinking. You really got to rewrite that. Okay. And he is the author of several books, including Belief in Science, a guidebook to fact-based thinking. Jesus. Okay. Before I screw it up any worse, I'll just turn it over to Tyson.
Hi everyone, thank you for the warm welcome. I'm going to be talking about why it's so hard to make fact-based decisions and why it's so hard to say fact-based. It's a good topic, I think, for the Day of Reason. And frankly, when I suggested the topic to John, I had no idea what I was going to say about it. But I like to pose questions myself I don't have answers to, so I'm forced to think about them. So hopefully I'll have some answers for you. I'm not going to obviously be able to fix the world, but hopefully we'll get a little closer to, and at least do some thinking, some rambling discussion about what it is to be rational on this Day of Reason. And it brings up the question, I mean, why should we need a special day to remind us that reason is important? That's, kind of like, why do we need a special day to celebrate mothers? They should be important every day. And the fact of the matter is we do need a special day because we are continually reminded how much the alternative matters, how much belief and faith-based thinking matters. And we're reminded about that every day. Irrational thinking of all kinds permeates all of our decision-making as a society, as a people. And it's exhibited through religion, New Age thinking, or just basic flawed logic and flawed reason. For instance, we rely upon, some people rely upon faith for medical treatment. We promote irrational public health or environmental policies. And I threw the cover of this book on here because it's called The Merchants of Doubt. It's a very good book, I recommend. But the authors talk about how, we have so many experts in our society who sell us on irrational ideas and mistaken conclusions about social policy. For instance, in the areas of assessing the risks of things like DDT and ozone and climate change, or whether it be lying us into conflicts and wars. And so the question is, in the face of all this sort of bad decision making that we're exposed to, how can we start to do better? And so in general, we can think about what we can do to start improving our reasoning performance. And the first thing to do is understand sort of the barriers and the obstacles that get in the way of reason and rational thinking. These include things like, religious institutions, their practices, New Age thinking, greed and short-term thinking. These are all things I'm going to elaborate on more. And also our own brains get in the way. I'm going to talk about why that's true. And then we can, once we understand what these barriers are, we can start to dismantle them through science training and through showing a greater respect for facts, which is something I always sort of harp on. And finally, hopefully that will encourage more sort of rational decision making every day of the year. But like in all things, we should start with definitions. We're talking about today's Day of Reason, and to remind ourselves what reason is. So reason is the application of objectively valid facts and sound logic to arrive at conclusions and to make decisions about those facts. Rationality is often synonymous with reason, but rationality really refers to the practice of reason by people. So rational people practice reason. And I want to throw out a quick side note, and that is the topic of rationalization. What does that mean? we think of rational as a good thing, but rationalization is not necessarily a good thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that more, but rationalization is really the antithesis often of rationality. It's the process of making something seem rational when it's not. And so the bottom line is that we humans are really, really good at rationalizing practically anything. And so what we need is we need to get better at thinking rationally, not necessarily rationalizing. So, how do we go about making rational choices? When we have very little to offer us sort of general guidelines or signposts. And you think about it, it's not that easy. We have many of the questions that we're confronted with have very little data for us to work with in making a rational fact-based decision. Many choices are trade-offs. We have winners and losers, and so how do you sort of clearly see what is the more rational decision in those cases? And so a decision may be rational for one party, but irrational from a different perspective. And we know that blindly applying dogma doesn't work, but also it's not practical to be completely situational about everything. We need some general guidelines to help us. And so my answer to that is we do have one clear guiding principle that we can use as a general approach to more rational problem solving, and that is facts. Facts never steer us wrong in the end. And part of my, one of the main theses of my book is that decisions based upon facts are inherently superior to decisions based upon belief. And I think we need to remember that, because it's not something that's obvious to everybody. A complete understanding of the facts gives us at least the opportunity to make a better decision. A fully informed decision is generally the better decision. And that implies that our decisions are not swayed by incorrect or unfounded biases and assertions. Now, one misconception people often jump to is that, well, if all decisions are just driven by facts, we'd have this cold, heartless, sort of mechanical world we live in. And that's not the case at all. Remember I said that facts give us the opportunity to make the best decision. Like in a court of law, when you stand before a judge, each lawyer presents evidence, and the goal is to uncover all of the evidence so that once all the evidence is brought to light, we then have the opportunity to make the best decision. But that evidence doesn't necessarily direct or mandate or ensure what decision we decide to make. At least we have the opportunity to make the best decision and to weigh other sort of humanist factors into the equation. And there's one proven method for determining the facts. And you all know what that is. Science offers us the only real proven method for arriving at sound fact-based conclusions. And if you think about it, the fundamental basis of science is an unwavering respect for facts. And that is not generally true in other areas of human activity. In science, facts and logic can't be ignored. Facts and logic always exert themselves regardless of what one might hope or claim. In the end, facts always win. And a conclusion or decision that is not based on sound facts and logic essentially relies upon luck. So you could argue, well, in this case, we didn't know all the facts. It wasn't a sound decision. Our decision was based upon faith, and it turned out really well. Well, it turned out really well because of luck. And the important thing to remember is that the importance of facts does not just apply to scientific questions, but all questions that we deal with in our lives. Another misconception is that, reason is not natural, but belief is natural. Belief comes naturally. And this is something that the proponents of belief-based and fact-based thinking always put forth. Well, belief is natural. And I just say that's wrong, clearly. Reason is actually innate. Carl Sagan pointed out back in the original Cosmos series that primitive man simply could not have survived if he was not fact-based. I mean, nature was unforgiving. Facts won very quickly, and if he wasn't completely rational and fact-based in making decisions, he would not have survived, and we could not have evolved. In fact, the opposite is true. When it comes to belief, we clearly have to be taught to believe. We have parochial schools and other institutions that take 8, 10, 12 years, teaching us to ignore facts and to trust in belief. That doesn't suggest to me it comes naturally. But there is a problem that although I don't think belief is sort of natural and intrinsic, our brains are highly susceptible to it. Kind of like you're highly susceptible to the flu. And so, although we've evolved to be very good at believing, which is the case, that doesn't mean that that trait is a good trait. Species go extinct all the time because they have traits that perhaps weren't fatal at one time, but as the environment changes, that trait becomes a very detrimental one. And I served in my evangelism that the trait of our ability to believe so easily is one that no longer is benign. It endangers us. So the question is why, and it's important to understand now why we're so susceptible. Because unless we really understand why we're so susceptible to belief, we can't really be on guard against it. Well, one is because our brains are simply neural networks. I'm a computer scientist, and a neural network is a computer science algorithm that connects inputs with outputs. And so once this network of inputs and outputs is trained through facts you give it, it then becomes automatic to zip from this set of inputs to this output. That's how a neural network works. And that is a very good representation of how our brains work. So our brains are, in the same way a computer network is trained, our brains are trained with exposure to facts, they form connections. Right? The bottom line is that our brains can learn incorrect facts as easily as correct facts. And so we're exposed to these incorrect facts all the time in society.
It's not a fact.
We're exposed to them through religious training and practice, through cultural training and practices, and also through our professional trainings and the challenges we face. And I'm going to elaborate on that. Before I do, let me just say, I'm going to throw this in and say, beliefs I view as viruses that infect rationality. Beliefs infect rational thinking, and there's no such thing as a harmful or benign belief. Every exposure to belief additively trains that neural network and makes it more susceptible to further beliefs and to more profound beliefs. The other misconception is that, weak-minded people's brains can be retrained. That's for them. But one of the other things I try to say is that every one of us, including myself, our brains are susceptible to being trained with incorrect facts. And so we cannot completely defend ourselves just through conscious effort alone. It's like when you're growing up, you don't consciously decide to learn English. You're exposed to it. And whether you want to or not, even if you tried to block it out, you would learn English. In the same way you learn beliefs and nobody is completely immune to them. So I think we have to detect and quarantine beliefs as if they were infectious diseases. So why is it so easy for us to accept and adopt these incorrect facts? Well, one is beliefs are just simpler, very often. Another is they often serve our goals when the facts do not. A third one is they often benefit those who would seek to exploit us. And here's a more subtle problem too, is that as we're exposed to these supposedly incorrect facts, we actually adopt those and they start to seem real to us. They become intuitive, they become obvious. And so the problem is that we actually start to believe them, truly. And think about this, the goal of most professions other than science is not to respect or be true to facts, it's to use facts. And if you think about most professions other than scientists, I think you'll find this is true. If you think about a lawyer, you think of them as being very fact-based. Well, they are, but their goal is to pick and choose those facts that support the outcome they want for their client. So that they're trained to use facts, not to respect facts. And that's true in marketing and all other areas in which we normally function and work. So the bottom line is, in the end, we get lots and lots of practice in abusing facts and in defying reason. And I'll point out that very often this is complicated by the fact that goals themselves are often a fact in themselves. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. Often, the goals that we purport that we're trying to achieve are in themselves a misrepresented fact. Lots of Times they're misrepresented facts or assumptions that, that aren't true facts. And so by starting with that assumption that this is our goal, we go completely the wrong direction. Secondly, many beliefs, our rationalizations are outright fake. Very often, people don't really believe what they say they do. Often, beliefs are really just a justification to a behavior, not really a true motivation. You know, they say it's a motivation, it's really just a justification. But again, often when we use belief as justification, we end up eventually starting to actually believe them and adopting those. Again, because I'm going to go back to this now, because our brains are only know what they're told. Although we're naturally analytic, it's garbage in, garbage out. And our neural networks can learn false facts just as easily as true facts. And this is compounded by other sort of physiological anomalies. One is that our perceptions are easily fooled and easily biased. So actually what we perceive is a small fraction of what is perceivable. And most of what our brains filter in is what it is biased to want to see. And there's lots of studies that demonstrate that. And secondly, we tend to think of our memories as our bedrock of what is true and rational and reasonable. And yet our memories are incredibly malleable and manipulable. People think of our memory as some sort of videotape that was shot 10 years ago that we bring back out of the archive, and it's absolutely not. It is a docudrama that's recreated every time we invoke it. And every time we invoke it, it's like a telephone game. We bias it a little bit further. Right? So even this bedrock that we rely upon, our memories, is very susceptible to distortion effects. And so since our brains are essentially a pattern recognition system, that pattern recognition system is evolved to err on the side of false positives. That is, if you were an early man in the jungle, it would be far more important that you falsely recognize a shadow as a tiger than that you mistakenly not recognize a shadow as a tiger. Right? So this is one of our distortion effects. Our pattern recognition system, our neural network, is biased towards false positives. Oh, that looks like Jesus in the whipped cream. So our brains, and there's also this rationalizing problem. Our brains are very capable, are really good at taking any set of facts we're exposed to and rationalizing them to make them seem reasonable. And there's dramatic examples of this. I mean, there's brain injury victims who can take the most bizarre set of illogical facts and rationalize these into a coherent, believable framework. And that's an evolutionary advantage, right? If you were some early man and you had brain damage and you see all these bizarre things, you would be dead if you couldn't rationalize them somehow and make them seem okay to you. So our brains all of us, healthy people, are really good at rationalizing any set of facts to make it seem real to us. And that's the point. Once rationalized, once learned, any set of false facts can become just then the obvious thing to us. When we see 1 + 1 is 3, boy, it just seems obvious, and it's an instant answer in our brain. Well, it's something that we can't question anymore. It becomes inescapable. Our brains are incredibly susceptible to all sorts of cognitive biases, and I just listed a few here. Selective perception, confirmation bias. These are just two obvious biases. The first one is that we notice things that confirm our beliefs, and the second one just says that when we notice things, we weigh things that confirm our beliefs with much greater credibility than other things. And this is just a tiny list. I checked Wiki when I prepared this slide, and there's over 160 different cognitive biases that we're susceptible to. A second bias that's really important, worth mentioning, I think, is just the authority bias. If I stand up here and I talk like this, you're much more likely to think, oh, that sounds credible, that sounds reasonable, than if I sort of talk, about, so scientists kind of speculate that maybe this is this. So I put Rush Limbaugh's picture up there because he's a tremendous example. He knows that through sheer power of will and timbre of your voice and certainty in your attitude that people will believe you, because we have this bias towards weighting that with much more credibility and authority. Second one is our susceptibility to fallacious and specious arguments. So just to kind of define those, fallacious means it's a conclusion that's based on a mistaken belief. And specious is something that's misleadingly plausible but wrong. And so a logical fallacy then is a pattern of a type of reasoning that is specious. It is always wrong. Right? So for instance, if I say, well, the person who said that is stupid, well, that's argument by ridicule or ad hominem attack. That the logic of that is always wrong in every case. And so I put up Sean Hannity's picture there. I don't know if Sean Hannity fan. I'm actually a fan. I spend a lot of time listening to him. And if you want to get better and learn how to either avoid, detect, or maybe even perpetrate specious arguments, you get a master's course every time you listen to this man. He's a master at this.
He's also a liar.
And the interesting thing, he knows it too. I've listened to him many times, and he's aware that he's using these specious arguments. But this is his, he's an expert at it. He does it very well. But we need to get better at recognizing specious arguments and simply writing these off immediately rather than getting into long discussions. It's much better if we can recognize these specious arguments and see them as a category of arguments that we can dismiss rather than get caught up into arguing each one. Another bias I had to mention here is the greed bias. Because we're talking about why beliefs seem to win so often. Well, you have to admit that one reason is greed. Greed is often the primary motivation for rejecting reason and embracing belief. Many decisions are rational only with respect to greed, how they benefit greed. Decisions based on greed often require extreme distortions of facts and logic. They often emphasize short-term benefits over long-term benefits, and they often help the very few instead of the many. So it's not that greed and rational thinking can't correspond. I'm suggesting they very often do not. Another problem that gets in the way of rational thinking, I would argue, is our tolerance for belief. The truth is that not all ideas are worthy of the same level of respect. And if we tolerate propositions that have no sort of factual merit, then we legitimize them. And we diminish rationality when we treat these beliefs with the same level of respect we do sort of a scientific consensus. And in truth, if we can't sort of relatively weigh propositions based upon their alignment with reality, then we really have no basis to judge any proposition at all, do we? And I will point out that people deserve respect, but beliefs do not. Beliefs don't inherently deserve respect. And I spent a long time deciding if I wanted this bullet point in here. I realize there may be some agnostics in the group, but I decided to keep it in because maybe it'll be agnostic with regard to agnosticism. But I have to say that in my mind, the arguments for agnosticism play into the hands of those who want to promote belief-based thinking. Agnosticism says, well, look, there's all these agnostics that are more reasonable, that accept that this belief could be true. You other people who deny it, you're just closed-minded. And I have to point out that the rejection of a crazy proposition is not unscientific. Because there's this general message that's been communicated in society that somehow agnosticism is more sort of scientific or has more intellectual integrity. But it is not more scientific. I mean, a scientist has to reject propositions that are just simply fail to be proven or to meet any level of justification. It's not unscientific for a scientist to say, I can say categorically pigs don't fly. And that is not an unscientific or closed-minded approach. Scientists are open-minded with regard to new facts. But being a scientist doesn't mean that you never form a conclusion about any set of facts. Right? All right, now let's flip the page and start. Given all these barriers, what can we do to start improving? Well, so here's things you could do to improve your own rational thinking. One is remember the difference between rational and rationalizing. Don't get caught up in rationalizing. Be vigilant for those distortion effects that color your perceptions, that color your memories. And the bottom line is don't really trust completely in your own thinking or things that seem obvious to you. Scientists don't. A good scientist doesn't trust in what seems obvious to him. He checks it. He confirms it. We were just watching Mythbusters the other night and noticing that very often the Mythbusters go into a show saying, I don't believe this is going to work. And they find that it works, or vice versa. Right? They don't trust their own thinking or their own conclusions or what seems obvious to them. They test it. Do trust in the scientific method and scientific consensus. At some point, when enough scientists agree, it is simply unreasonable and irrational to continue to say, well, I'm still not sure about that. That is the best information we have. We should trust in it and move forward. And here's an important one. A way to be sure that you're not rationalizing too much is to constantly go back to first principles. Because what happens in marketing, in brainwashing, in rationalizations is that we move in little tiny increments, little tiny steps that we don't really perceive as being irrational. So what happens is, somebody will say to you, well, you can imagine that scientists don't know everything, right? You say, well, I guess that's reasonable. You go here. Well, then you could, if that's the case, then you could imagine that maybe there are aliens on the planet. Well, that's reasonable. And so pretty soon somebody says, well, if that's true, it's very possible there's aliens waiting to pick you up when you commit suicide and die, right? Because you're way over here. And if you had looked back to the starting point, you'd have said, how did I get here? But every little step seemed reasonable. So when I say, frequently that's what scientists do, right? They go back to basics, to first principles, to fundamentals, and say, where am I? Have I drifted really far off? And here's an important one. Since belief-based thinking is infectious, and since you can't protect yourself from it, quarantine yourself from it, right? Hang around with other people who are fact-based and rational in their thinking. All right, how about some things you can do interacting with other people? Well, one is, I have to say, stop affording unearned respect to beliefs that have no merit. The second thing is practice and learn to recognize logical fallacies when they're presented, so you can respond to them quickly and not waste a lot of time. Stop accepting false equivalences between fact and belief. Very often you have, you had the media for a long time, falling into that trap and saying, well, many scientists agree about evolution, but on the other hand, many scientists, are not sure, there's no, it's a false equivalence. You've got, 100,000 scientists on the side of climate change. You've got 2 meteorologists on the other side. There's not sort of an equivalence here the media tries to portray. And I would say, don't be namby-pamby when it comes to speaking out in support of actual facts, actual fact-based conclusions. Okay, things we can do to promote rational thinking in public policy. One is don't even consider doing nothing. Be involved, help, part of the solution. And trust that in the end, facts do actually matter. Because any decision that's not fact-based, that doesn't consider the facts, is ultimately going to fail. And in the end, no matter how much we might want to imagine that CO2 isn't going to affect us, in the end, it is going to affect us. And in the effects, facts matter. Trust that in the end, facts really matter. Wage the small battles. The small battles are really important. Don't say, oh, well, this issue with in God we trust and the money, it's not a big issue, who cares? The small issues really do matter, really do make a difference. Because again, there are no benign beliefs. All these things accumulate and promote belief-based thinking. And I've often been very critical of my fellow scientists because I think that over the decades they failed to speak out sufficiently in support of their conclusions, in support of facts. But I say that it's also the burden of all of us when they do that to support them and to make sure that they have the support they need when they step out of their safe scientific circles and speak out. And finally, here's my personal plea. Require that your candidates for public office actually exhibit fact-based thinking. I would say, in my mind, any politician, especially for president, who is unable or unwilling to acknowledge evolution and climate change are not fit for public office. They should be able to pass test. And I would say things you could do then to infect others with reason. We get infected with belief all the time. How can we infect them with reason? Well, demonstrate, mentor, model sound scientific problem solving. I learned, when I was in graduate school, I learned, I think, a huge amount of rational thinking by just observing how my research advisor would go about approaching and solving a problem. So don't just give a conclusion, take your listeners through the steps in getting there. Channel Carl Sagan and Tyson and Cox. Just channel these people and share your wonder and awe in the natural universe. Get excited, talk it up. And remember that you do have good beliefs. I mean, we believe in facts, reason, and a very powerful set of humanist principles. Those are very strong beliefs. Don't let the other side tell you that you have no principles, no basis, no core. And finally, recommend books and shows to other people. Promote them that promote humanist values, fact-based thinking, and all the rest. I can't go into a lot of detail in this presentation, but just a little tidbit. Start to become smarter consumers of statistics. Statistics are really probability facts. And those are very real, very important things that we have to do better at trying to cope with, understand, and deal with. Understand risk assessment and its role in problem solving. Right? In a lot of times when there are competing interests on two sides, you have to do sort of a risk analysis to say, what is the risk of ignoring global warming versus the cost versus actually doing something about it, and what is the cost of that? And that risk analysis is often a very important fact that needs to be included in these decisions. Load your brain up, keep studying the history of science, and load your brain up with a lot of inspirational stories about how science evolved, scientific thinking evolved, and the challenges they went through and the kind of accomplishments they made. And never get too old to learn more science. Science isn't for grade schoolers, it's for every one of us, and keep learning. Two more things you do. I have my book here. You can get on Kindle. It's only $5.
SPECIOUS or FALLACIOUS?
What's
the title?
It's called Belief in Science, a guidebook to fact-based thinking. And
the science of belief, that's the whole thing.
And the science of
It's a
belief.
whole title.
Yes,
Don't
Belief in
shortchange
Science and the
yourself.
Science of
Who's the
Belief.
author?
And it basically goes into many of the topics I touched on here in far greater detail, as well as a lot of other interesting things too. And finally, I do have a short video if you don't have any patience for books or you want to have somebody else. You can look this up on YouTube. It's a short 15-minute video I did that kind of talks in a fun way about fact-based thinking and decision-making.
Well, Tyson, because I know you for a while, and I read your book, and I think the basis, the fundamentals of what you're saying, if I reduce it, is don't be delusional. Don't have false beliefs. Deal with the facts. And I think that this is a wonderful thing to inculcate children. But there's a fallacy in your view, and it's this. Delusion is the natural opiate of the brain. It's what protects people from pain. So just a case in point, Charlie and Dave Koch are incredibly greedy people. They are whole worship money, they'll do anything for money. And how do they make their money? How do they get so rich? By carbon-based energy production, oil and gas. Now they're told by the liberals that we have climate warming and change because of too much carbon dioxide. Now that threatens their thing that they hold most valuable, which is their money. So they have a delusion that there's no such thing as climate change and that this is just evil liberals who are, and that's why they support what they support. So the thing is that if you went over to the Koch brothers and you said, look, it's very obvious that as you thicken the atmosphere, you're going to get global warming. It's obvious. That's why in the stratosphere it's cold, because there's no air the air is too thin to hold the heat. Whereas at ground level, it holds the heat. It's very obvious. And these people are intelligent guys, but because it causes them pain that they're going to lose money, they have to have the delusion that global warming is false. And so how do you get by that? That's the real problem.
Well, I think that's everything you said is pretty much in keeping with what I presented. I mean, greed is a motivation that causes us to then rationalize a belief And it may be that at some point maybe they started or actually believe it now because they
Yeah,
said it
yeah. The
often.
point is, you can't
And so-
convince. You couldn't convince them.
Well, you possibly could. Again, our brains are malleable. You can actually change people's minds. We do it all the time. Marketing does it all the time. Brainwashing does it all the time. We can change people to be more fact-based or less fact-based in their training. And so I'm more concerned, though, about making sure that other people can assess the arguments they're making and see them as not fact-based and motivated by greed and self-interest. By giving them the
So you
tools
want
to think
to. So
more
I
rationally.
think what you're doing is you want to heighten the consciousness of people who are basically thinking normally.
Well, and there are people who would sort of accept the beliefs put forth by them that serve their self-interest. But if they can be, if they can recognize logical fallacies, recognize poor arguments, recognize the motivations for these things, and as we all hope to do, think more rationally, we can start to push back and make better decisions.
I'm interested in what you think about the third estate, the journalistic constellation out there, because, for instance, in yesterday's business section of the New York Times, they talked about how basically it's just a supply and demand thing at this point. Rachel Maddow has her propaganda, and Sean Hannity has his propaganda, and they're literally just two different stations owned by two different corporations. And it seems to me that they're both benefiting from the public airways, and there doesn't seem to be any regulatory framework that says you have a responsibility to present facts, not propaganda. And I'm wondering, whether you think that there's any hope to actually get facts back into our information flow, because even Facebook is beginning to just go on what we said we liked before and feed us more of it.
I know it's an excellent comment, excellent observation. Clearly, under Reagan, the privatization of our news media has been a significant problem. We used to have a news media that was more dedicated to objectivity and presenting facts. It's hard to find that nowadays. I will say, I'll put in one plug. We have some efforts to try to do that. The internet in general helps to equalize things. I know that much of the millennial generation doesn't pay attention to those established sources, the New York Times, the NBC, the Fox, because they recognize that these are self-interested organizations that don't present a real picture. And they go out and they're consumers of a wide variety of things on the internet. And so protecting internet neutrality and making sure that continues to have a large number of voices adding to the conversation really helps. And again, there's some, I will say, I don't know how successful they're going to be, but take a look at Al Jazeera. I mean, they've come out making a concerted effort to try to meet this need, to try to be a more objective news organization again. I wish them well. I hope they do.
You haven't mentioned the H word, heuristics, which is what I find in my daily life I'm more involved in about judging the truth through heuristics, in other words, through those markers and rules of thumb, than I am as, let's say, playing the role of scientist, actually investigating global warming. I have to decide who am I going to credit.
You better define heuristics. I bet
That's a heuristic is a rule of thumb by which we make decisions.
Shortcut.
Common sense.
No, it's not common sense.
It's a shortcut.
It's not common sense.
I mean,
Because we can actually state the principle that we're using in a heuristic.
Give us an example.
One example is a guy who is a very adept skier, and one day he leads a group onto the actually not onto the slope, but the behind the slopes, and he looks at the situation and he said, "Oh, we'll be fine." He's done some, he's gone back to his experience, he's put some rules of thumb to what he got. He goes out and they're all killed in an avalanche. That's where heuristics goes wrong, because basically it's a shortcut, but we can't every day, every decision we have to make, we can't really go through a totally scientific.
Right,
uh,
so
So we go these shortcuts. And
we
sometimes-
definitely can't do a full scientific analysis
Yeah.
and acquire all the facts relating to every decision in front of us. And so there's two things. One is we have to rely upon, let me make 2 points regarding this. One is we have to rely upon experts. And so what becomes really important is to learn how to judge the veracity and how much credibility we want to provide this expert testimony. So look at things like, who is funding them? What is the nature and quality of the information they're providing? Is it based on actual facts? We have to become better at assessing our experts because we have to rely upon experts in this complex world. But secondly, in terms of heuristics, that part of that is just we have to trust in our pattern recognition system. Our brains recognize patterns in situations around us and makes decisions that are these neural network jumps from this set of facts to this conclusion. This set of facts here, these shadows, I'm going to run. And so it's important that we keep that neural network, again, fact-based, so that we have actual real connections that align with the real world, rather than having a bunch of connections that are distorted by symbolics, by beliefs, by constructs that don't really align with real consequences in the real world.
Let me give you just a very brief example. Someone wanted to convince me of the benefit of following a certain nutritional system. So they sent me a bunch of links that they said were documented in journals, actual studies. And when I looked at it, I found that most of the journals weren't listed in the, even though they were, quote, peer-reviewed, weren't listed in the National Library of Medicine. And those that were, when I investigated them, didn't really seem to be studies, right? Yet here was someone on the internet making very strong scientific sounding claims, right? So my heuristic is, this is crap.
And it's a good heuristic.
Okay.
I mean, we have to, you're doing what we should do, but it is complicated by the fact that these special interests that want to convince us to ignore facts and adopt their beliefs will often cloak themselves and guise themselves in this scientific facade. And they try to align themselves and look scientific. They make scientific sorts of statements and quotations, and they reference scientific experts. And so that makes it much more difficult to make good conclusions. We have, again, the book I mentioned, Merchants of Doubt. This book shows how a handful of scientists managed to create an incredible amount of doubt about very clear conclusions, but managed to make the whole political community and most of the public have significant doubts about these things because they guise themselves in the garb of authority, of scientific authority, and using the sort of language and terminology of scientific authority. So we have to be careful of science being co-opted. It is the bottom line, and in general.
It's not the science, I'm sorry, it's the who sponsored that research.
Yeah, it's part of it, yes.
You
yes.
have to look at the research.
If it's
So
published
when I
by
look at
a Christian
person-
university,
Exactly.
it is probably not a legitimate paper.
Then
yes.
I will do a little more digging
Absolutely.
before even I accept it. But my question was different. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and in session I've seen a lot of children with a lot of fear, religious-based fear that they inherited from their parents, from the church. And I'm not a lawyer, there might be a lawyer in this floor, I don't know, but isn't that considered as a child abuse?
Well, many of us would consider that, yes.
Richard
Now,
Dawkins would say that.
clearly the parents feel like they're
It breaks
giving
my
their.
heart because when I see these children have nightmares, they can't sleep. And I have to call a psychiatrist for referral. As a family therapist, I don't deal with cognitive problems. This is a cognitive psychology, and you have an intellectual human race, and you're using this religion suppressed through cognitive psychology that you're saying.
Well,
That's pure cognitive
you
psychology.
raise a very delicate but a very real point, and that is, to what extent do parents or the infrastructure around them have responsibility to sort of not inculcate and indoctrinate and their children with crazy facts. I mean, whether it be a neo-Nazi parent that is instilling all sorts of racial or prejudicial biases, or whether it's religion instilling all sorts of crazy religious views. How does society deal with this? It's a very difficult problem, clearly. I think the answer is that, we have to provide enough input from the greater society that facts and reason will sort of filter in and start to override, or at least cause them to start questioning what they're hearing from their immediate authority figures.
I think every grown-up child should file a lawsuit against their parents.
Who's next?
Yeah, I think a lot of people find it's more important to have an opinion than to have facts. But an opinion suggests an investment of some aspect of your emotional construct. So, when I think it's good to sort of hold back in developing an opinion and try to memorize a whole lot of facts, which of course will express an opinion, but don't get too involved in the emotional investment of because as the facts change, you will find it more difficult if you have invested that much of your emotional energy in it.
Right, and you touch upon this problem that in most of what we do, we really start with the conclusion, and we find facts to support it. And as the facts change, we have to keep rationalizing them somehow more and more into crazier constructs to keep justifying the conclusion.
And the opinion is a shortcut. When somebody says something, you give them the opinion instead of giving them the facts.
Yes,
Which is it's
Absolutely.
not good for
totally
them
agree.
and not good for you.
Yep.
Get
I
Donna.
can't, oh, go ahead.
Donna.
Oh, one of the things I discovered last summer was in the company of somebody who's a really good, reasonable arguer, somebody from an old political family, Jean, in Vermont. And she just has a wonderful technique when she's ready to disagree with someone. First thing she does is say, on what facts do you base your opinion? And I noticed it really starts things going, and she ends up getting a lot of points in, which works a lot better than I think you're full of shit.
Yeah. No, that's great.
And I want to say that's one thing you can watch people who do it well. And then the other thing you said that really resonated with me is keep educating yourself in science. I haven't had much. I've never had any real scientific education, and I'm an octogenarian now, and my brain is slipping. But I've been in my husband's wonderful discussion group, and there we have to read science. We get homework, a lot of it, homework and philosophy, and I find my brain's getting sharper. I'm getting some gray cells back, so I want to underscore what you said about that. This is very important.
Both fantastic.
Let's make sure we get our own
I've created a monster.
And to elaborate on what you're saying, the benefit of continuing to study science is not just to learn science stuff, but it's again to retrain your network so that it thinks in terms of verifying and logical sequences and isn't as likely to be misled by sort of fabricated or specious logical flow within the brain. It keeps it trained.
As Abraham Lincoln said, don't believe everything you read on the internet.
I can't resist sharing this story with you all. Woody Allen told us years ago that there was a news report of two southern fishermen out in the swamp, and they saw a light coming. It was an alien spaceship, and the aliens came down, spoke with them, and the news media came and interviewed them later, and they said, well, what were the aliens like? I said, well, they were very similar to us, and they picked up our language. They speak English because they monitored our radio, our television broadcast. Well, was there any difference that you could detect in the way that they used the language? Do they have an accent of some kind? No, they really didn't. But I noticed one thing, one of the guys said, is that they consistently said hermeneutics when they meant heuristics, and heuristics when they meant hermeneutics.
Sounds like Woody Allen.
I find myself troubled by your use of the term false fact. First, it strikes me as an oxymoron, but I'm wondering if something is recognizable as a false fact and it should be a falsity. I think you are referring to facts that predominate within society, or views that predominate, beliefs that predominate in society, and are incorrectly accepted as facts.
Yeah, you could substitute as purported and commonly accepted facts. It's just a shorthand.
We need a better term that I think
Yeah, if it's false, it's not a fact.
we need. I think we really need a better term that correctly
Delusion versus a fact.
And I will say that in my
junk
book
can
there's a
be
whole
real.
section on defining this, so that would be one place where there's a little more elaborate.
In fact, sometimes you get
Guys,
useful junk.
if I may, I brought this same subject up in our newsletter, and I'm going to interject right now. All of you new people, we got our basic propaganda and copies of the newsletter there. Don't miss them when you are. But I brought this up before, and in the newsletter, I use two words that I think are too often conflated and confused in our society, in our language: belief and faith. And the way I use the word, and I take people's stuff and I correct them. The way I use the word belief is the expectation of truth based on experience or evidence. Faith is the expectation of truth without evidence or even contradictory to evidence and experience. And I think we should keep those two words. I know you use belief here, but you did use the word faith a couple of times. I would keep those two separate. Just the same thing that we're talking about, facts and false facts and truth and delusions and whatnot. That's all.
And there's also feel. I feel that this is true.
Yeah. Stick your
You've
feelings.
been had your head up a long time.
Okay. I wonder how you feel about balkanization of opinions, where society breaks apart into separate groups that don't talk to each other. If somebody from Group A goes into Group B and starts trying to influence the debate, everybody's rude to them and drives them out. They defriend each other on Facebook. They form their own news networks, create
these
their own
bubbles,
facts,
right?
circulate their own facts, don't cross-examine each other's facts because they agree with the general drift of where they're going.
Well, and these bubbles are especially dangerous, right? Because then they just fit into all the things I'm talking about in terms of reinforcing and biasing
Yeah,
our
everything gets
perception.
reinforced, and you hear things from so many people in your network that you think they're true because nobody's.
But
shooting
on
them down.
on the other side, I'll relate one story. I just saw this last week watching an episode of Years of Living Dangerously. I don't know if you are watching that, but this is a show about global warming on Showtime. Don Cheadle, an actor, went down to a small Texas town to talk about global warming. And of course, everybody in this evangelical sort of town was, thought that it was absolutely ridiculous. There's no, the facts are out, the science is inconclusive. And they had this religious minister woman go in and talk to them. And when the people came out, Cheadle interviewed them again. And one guy who, going in, said there was absolutely no possibilities, this is all nonsense. He came out saying, well, I'm thinking about it. There's something to it. And he said, well, what changed your mind? He goes, well, it was the fact that she's one of us, and she was saying this.
Yeah.
This is the in-group bias I mentioned there.
Okay, I remember when I was in college, the local city council wanted to close down the head shops, and a bunch of students went to argue, and the students were all against closing the head shop, and there were a bunch of concerned parents and very Republican religious people, and there was this one guy who was an adult libertarian, about 35 years old, and he gave his speech, and then at the end of his thing, he mentioned that he was a Protestant minister, and he quoted the Apostle Paul as saying, "Mind your own business," and that had more impact
Than anything else.
than anything all these students said.
Yeah. Larry?
Well, this reminds me that there's some mention. We have to be careful of what I call a moral equivalency. That if two people have an argument, sometimes people have an argument and there is a moral equivalency. Other times there isn't. Like, people will say Rachel Maddow is biased, Sean Hannity is biased. So they give them a moral equivalency. But the question is, how many lies are you going to catch
Rachel telling.
Rachel telling?
Versus
Where
Sean
it's,
telling.
yeah, where there was Sean,
No comparison.
that just objectively lies, not opinion, but that out and out lie. And the reason he can get away with the lie is because the people that are listening to him and like him want to hear that. It's like they want to hear that.
Lies for Jesus, John.
Yeah, liars for Jesus.
I just wanted to raise two different examples where I am having a difficulty making decisions because they're illustrative of how complex modern life is. And one is energy policy, where I used to be a socially responsible institutional investor, and we weighted our portfolios toward natural gas. And now I find a lot of the environmentalists who used to focus on climate change are now focusing on fracking, and that natural gas has become the enemy. And it's very interesting to remember all of the negative biases about, not in my backyard kinds of movements that went on historically. And I actually had the privilege to hear two members of the IPCC, scientists who participated in the most recent climate change report, and both of them basically said they saw natural gas as an important transitional fuel in the next 50 years, particularly in China, so that they could get away from coal. And it was all about literally looking at how many kilocalories were created by each and how much carbon was created by each. But the reason I bring this up is it's very, very complex. My husband and I disagree about nuclear power for the same reason. So energy is one area in which you have to have expertise in about 5 different areas to make a good decision. And yet we're all asked to vote on these issues. So I just wondered, A, how you approach energy policy, and I'll come back to my second question after that.
Well, I mean, I like you, I'm equally, have difficulty judging bad alternatives, between bad alternatives. And I certainly am sympathetic to the problems that fracking I don't want to see our water in New York become contaminated. On the other hand, I don't want to see climate fail. So it's a very difficult set of trade-offs, and I have to say that I'm not, probably none of us are fully equipped to, or nor should we have to make the best decision. But we should rely upon the people that we elect and put in the position of making these decisions are actually fact-based scientific thinkers, and not coming from the industry, not coming from a religious perspective, but can actually make sound, objective, non-specious, rational, fact-based decisions in choosing, between similarly bad alternatives with consequences and side effects for all of us.
Let me just ask
The second part.
Every election is an alternative between bad alternatives.
That's true. Every decision is as well.
I think you really winded up.
Okay, last, since you're dying to raise your second half, that'll be the last question.
Okay, so the second one was about substance abuse and legalization of marijuana. And one of the things that I learned early in my career was I was asked to do an epidemiological study associated with the health effects of nuclear radiation from weapons manufacturing facilities and nuclear power plants in Connecticut. And what I discovered is epidemiology is really, really underfunded. Like going back 40 or 50 years, we understand how we can look at diseases in populations, but very little is done. And very little data is collected. And so when you have a political and economic structure that underfunds huge areas that could inform our decision making, it's incredible. And so I think about that now in the sense that I used to smoke a lot of pot. I understand what pot does, but it doesn't really help us make rational decisions.
But who cares?
Right. Well, I mean, the meme that's going around is there's very few people who have actually, been killed by marijuana. I just think of Patrick Kennedy, and I think there's a Republican who's also in recovery that are talking about maybe we should slow down a little bit on this, and because there's not a lot of data about how this is all going to work, and when the hookah bars are just as numerous as the taverns of the world. So I wonder how you think about that area of life, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, something. My opinion is an opinion like anybody else's, not necessarily better, but I look at all the known bad effects of our war against pot, and I say we certainly want to get rid of all those negative consequences. And I think we know enough about the safety of pot in general that we can deal legislatively with reasonable controls and regulations around it.
Yeah.
in part, it's actually the cure is worse than the medicine.
Well, the laws.
Thank you, everyone. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure.